Good evening. Welcome to the Filson Historical Society. I'm Mark Wetherington, Director, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight for what I know will be a very interesting program, Thomas Nast, the father of modern political cartoons, with Dr. Fiona Deans Halloran. I want to thank you for being here. I was remarking this is the first time I can remember in a while that we've had sun shining when we started an evening program, so I appreciate you coming in and being with us. Our mission at the Filson is to collect, preserve, and tell the significant stories of Kentucky and the Ohio Valley region's history and culture. And a part of that culture and political culture are cartoons. We have a really nice cartoon collection here. We have one example of actually a Thomas Nast cartoon over here that our speaker might have time to point to later, and we'll see. And if we have any additional questions, Jim Holmberg, Curator of Special Collections, can certainly bring you up to speed. If you're not a member of the Filson, we'd love to have you join us. We're a private, nonprofit historical society. We're not supported by government funding, so we would appreciate your membership. Sarah Strapp's at the back of the room holding up her hand. So this is the commercial part of our program, and I'll now move along to why you are here. I want to thank C-SPAN for being here, and also I see a number of students here from Presentation Academy and I believe Trinity, so we always welcome you and thank you very much for joining. Dr. Fiona Deans Halloran is the Department Chair of U.S. History and AP History teacher at Rowland Hall St. Mark's School in Salt Lake City. Prior to her position at Rowland Hall, Dr. Halloran was an assistant professor at Eastern Kentucky University and a visiting assistant professor at Bates College. She earned her BA at American University and her PhD in American History from the University of California, Los Angeles. She has been a research fellow at the Huntington Library and the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. In addition to Thomas Nast, the father of modern political cartoons, she has contributed to Europe, 1450 to 1789, Encyclopedia of Early American World. Dr. Halloran published numerous essays and chapters including Shall I Trust These Men? Thomas Nast and Post-War Black Manhood, in Fathers, Preachers, Rebels, and Men, Black Masculinity in the U.S. History and Literature, 1820 to 1925, and Oppose Everything, Propose Nothing, Influence and Power in the Political Cartoons of Thomas Nast in Drawing the Line, Cartoons and History. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Halloran to the Filson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you also to Judy Miller and to Jamie and Scott here at the Filson who helped to bring me here and to make this evening possible and to help answer any questions, particularly Scott, who today confirmed my very closest friend's instincts and emailed me to say, stop worrying. That was very nice, thank you, and effective. So just before we begin, I would like to mention this image on your right, because it's not actually a cartoon in the sense of a published cartoon, but it's a particularly charming example of something Thomas Nast did all the time, which is that it's a thank you note. And rather than send traditional thank you notes, Thomas Nast had a tendency to draw himself, which he has done here, very typically, as you can see, short, tubby, and unkempt. He loved to draw his facial hair all over the place. And he's written this little note to thank the family of Henry Watterson, the editor of the local paper, for welcoming him here in Louisville. And he did that all the time with drawings of himself, partly because people really liked it, and partly because having grown up in New York City, as I'll tell you, with a very inadequate education, he was not capable of writing a thank you note that anyone would consider gracious. So if his wife was unable to do it for him, and she wrote almost everything that you would ever see that actually purports to be Nast's, if she couldn't do it for him, he didn't do it because his spelling was phonetic German accent spelling. So mine is M-E-I-N, and his handwriting can only be described as horrific. So people often want to know how I came to write about Thomas Nast, and it's a story that originated in graduate school in California, where I was contributing material for an encyclopedia being produced by my advisor, and I chose his name out of a list thinking that it would be entertaining. And then when I went to look for materials about him, I couldn't find any. And I thought, well, I'm the world's worst graduate student, and they should kick me out, and I'm pathetic, and everyone's going to know. And I called my advisor and said, I don't know what I'm doing here. And she said, all right, well, let me look. And she looked, and she called me back and said, no, it's fine. It's not you. There is nothing to speak of about him. And I thought, oh, that's reassuring. So it turns out that what existed at that time was a biography published in 1904 by Albert Bigelow Paine, who was a newspaper writer for a children's magazine and newspaper, and who, this was his big break, was writing this book. There was a picture book by Morton Keller, published in 1968, which has wonderful text, but approximately 57 pages of it, so that's not really enough if you've become addicted. And then there's quite an odd book, but a great book if you're interested in eccentricity, published in the mid-90s by Roger Fisher, which is both a book about Nixon and a book about Nast's campaign against the Tweed ring. So if you can imagine that, go ahead. It's not the usual book, but it is really an interesting book when you get around that mentally. And then there are a few very good but very specific articles about him, and that's it. So it seemed like a good idea to write about him as a dissertation topic and as a way to bring his life back and provide him with a historical legacy, which I think he deserves, but which he has not enjoyed. And as it turns out, it has been a fascinating way to spend a decade. And it's made me a tiny bit evangelical on the subject of Nast's value to American history, which I think has been neglected. So I'll introduce you to him briefly so that you have a sense, if you don't know his basics of his life. He was born in 1840 in Landau, which at the time was a part of Bavaria. He emigrated to the US in 1846 with his mother, arriving in New York City. He was not a great student because he arrived precisely at the moment that you would become literate, except that he was expected to perform at school in a language he did not speak. So for example, his mother enrolled him in an English-speaking school. He went to school on the first day, and a little boy directed him into a line, and it turned out that was the spanking line. So he went home at lunch and said to his mother, I am never going back to school. And although she did find other schools for him, German-speaking schools, and it appears maybe one Catholic school, it didn't stick. And by 13, he was basically on the streets every day, the result of which was that at 15, he gave up entirely on his education and talked his way into a job with a sort of impresario of the illustrated press, Frank Leslie. And this is his drawing of himself doing that. And you can see that always he liked to draw himself as short and messy and not terribly defined in terms of his physique. So he worked first for Frank Leslie, and then more meaningfully and much longer for Harper's Weekly, both of which were dueling banjos, so to speak, of illustrated newspapers, the craze of the late 1850s and of the 1860s and 70s. And he primarily moved to Harper's Weekly because Frank Leslie didn't like to pay his employees, which was awkward, right? At Harper's, he built a career that catapulted him into fame and fortune for a while, and an enduring place in American art history and political history. And in his prime, he was the most famous cartoonist in the United States. He produced not just cartoons, but also illustrations and Christmas drawings for Harper's Weekly until the 1880s. The illustrations from the Civil War are especially famous now, and this is one of the illustrations that he produced, which depicts the attack on a border town by guerrilla fighters. And so what's great about this drawing is they're doing every bad thing you can imagine, right? They're drinking, they've committed vandalism, they're hanging a baby upside down by his ankle, they've killed some kid's puppy, they're stealing pocket watches, people are being bayoneted. It's really very bad. So he liked hyperbole, as you may have guessed. Unfortunately, his career ended not so much with a bang, but with a whimper. The frantic pace with which he produced cartoons, particularly in the early 1870s, began to wear out his arm and shoulder that he drew with. And as a consequence, he had to stop cartooning for a while, several times. And his work began to decline. It was less detailed, it was less precise, and people started to move on to other cartoonists who they thought were better. And then, after a conflict with his editor and the publishers of Harper's Weekly in 1877, he began to feel very dissatisfied with his position at the newspaper, the magazine. And in the 1880s, he returned his contract unsigned and left the paper for good. He tried to maintain his career by working for other papers and failed. He tried to build a career as a painter and failed. He tried to establish his own paper called Nast's Weekly. That also failed. In fact, it was perfectly awful. And finally, it really is very bad. The only complete collection is at the University of Minnesota's archives, and when you read them, you think, yeah, no. Finally, he turned to his connections in Theodore Roosevelt's administration. One of the people who worked for Theodore Roosevelt had also worked for Abraham Lincoln. and Nast had, as a result, had known him for like 40 years at that point. And so he called up Theodore Roosevelt's administration, metaphorically speaking, looking for some